In 1969, two miners set out in search of gold, and they made a record-breaking discovery. It's February 1969, and two Cornish prospectors are digging in the gold fields of Victoria, Australia. They then stumbled across something so unexpected that neither of the men could have believed their luck. Indeed, what they unearthed would have an indelible mark on history to this day. Victoria is the second most populated state in Australia, but in the mid-19th centuries, it had more in common with the American Wild West than anything else. That's because the country had its very own gold rush, and the promise of glittering riches brought people from all over the world to the middle of this nascent colony. The Australian gold rush was kicked off after a prospector discovered specks of gold near Bathurst in New South Wales in February 1851. Soon after, more of the yellow stuff was found in Victoria, and before long, money began pouring in, helping the country's goldfields prosper. Meanwhile, at the peak of the rush, around 2 tons of gold poured into Melbourne's Treasury building every week. And in the 1950s, an influx of the precious metal to Britain helped the country pay off its international debts and allowed it to expand in growing its empire in the latter half of the 19th century. As you'd expect, the huge number of miners that flocked to Australia from around the world had a dramatic effect on its population. In fact, a year after the gold discovery in New South Wales, over 500,000 people had arrived in the Australian goldfields. In some cases, town populations grew by 1,000%, and in one case by 3,000% over the period of a decade. Of course, those populations would leave as quickly as they had arrived once the supply of gold was exhausted. And with such huge demand and scarcity of the precious metal, production eventually began to slow. Furthermore, in 1915, the export of gold from Australia was prohibited, and the gold standard was abolished, leading to many towns being abandoned. But back in the 1850s, the gold rush was just getting started. Words of the discovery eventually spread to Britain, and in the ears of John Deason and Richard Oates. Former tin miners, the pair lived in Cornwall, a county on Britain's southwest coast at the time. Deason and Oates then decided to sail to Australia to seek their fortune as gold prospectors. With the former arriving in the country in 1853 and the latter the year after, the pair then headed southeast. And in 1862, the men ended up in the township of Malagal in Victoria. And thanks to the gold rush, Malagal was thriving. Boasting 11 pubs during the peak of the rush, around 1855, the town population reached some 16,000 people. And in 1862, it counted both Deason and Oates among its many gold prospecting residents. Digging for gold like other prospectors, Deason and Oates etched out a living, reliant only on the precious metal they found to be able to live. If consecutive digs yielded nothing, they quickly ran out of money and food. But then again, all the pair needed was one big score. Nevertheless, by early 1869, the pair were in debt. In fact, the men were so poor that they were refused credit to buy flour, according to the Dunolly Museum website. But still hopeful, Deason and Oates carried on digging, and on one February morning, the men moved to a new area to try their luck. At around 9 a.m., February 5th, 1869, Deason began digging in the new location. Aiming his pick around some tree roots in the area, it broke after a short while. According to the Denali Museum website, he reportedly shouted out claiming, "Damn it, I wish it was a nugget." Deason then decided to take a closer look at what had broken his pick, and the following moment was articulated well in a report in the Dunolly and Bedfordshire Express at the time. It wrote, "On stooping down to examine the obstacle, he found that the object of his dearest wish was lying at his feet." All of which meant just one thing: they'd struck gold. But the surprises didn't end there. Not only had the pair found gold, but the nugget looked huge. According to Deason's account of the event, written in 1905, he then asked his companion, "What do you think, Dick? Is it worth 6,000? Oh, he said, more like 2,600. The men then immediately excavated the huge chunk of precious metal, hauled it onto their cart, and took it back to Deason's shack. Meanwhile, Deason described what the pair did next in his 1905 account. The nugget itself was embedded in a layer of quartz, and in order to remove the mineral, the pair placed the mass on top of a fire. Once it had cooled, they set about breaking around 70 pounds of quartz away from the precious metal. Meanwhile, the process of breaking off the quartz had left a great deal of loose gold, according to Deason, but it was the main chunk which left the men flabbergasted. Measuring 24 inches long by 12 inches wide, needing to know how much it weighed before they could sell it though, Deason and Oates came up with a plan, and they stashed their find in a calico bag and waited until the following day. The following morning, Deason and Oates took their enormous nugget, later dubbed the Welcome Stranger, to the London Chartered Bank in the town of Donnelly to be weighed. Indeed, having found the gold they dreamed of, the men fully intended to sell it off. But even they couldn't have been prepared for what would happen next. That's because the gold nugget was so large that it didn't fit on the scales at the bank. so sledgehammers and chisels were taken to the hunk in order to break it into pieces. And 5 hours and several broken instruments later, the welcome stranger could finally be weighed. And the result? The gold totaled a whopping 210 pounds, making it the largest nugget ever found to this day. However, the pair neglected to commemorate their find while it was still whole. Indeed, no pictures of the welcome stranger exist. Indeed, any that you've seen are all replicas. Word of the incredible find then spread through the town of Dunolly, and a crowd formed at the bank, full of people wanting to see the enormous nugget. And when Deason and Oates received over $12,000 in exchange for the record-breaking find, they became instant celebrities. Meanwhile, Deason and Oates were incredibly generous with their find. According to the Dunolly and Bedfordshire Express, gold of at least a pound of weight was given by the delighted finders to their numerous friends, who were each anxious to retain a piece of the largest mass of gold the world has yet seen. Indeed, the welcome stranger caused a stir at the time, and why wouldn't it? Deason and Oates were living every digger's dream, and as a result, many were drawn to Dunolly to catch a glimpse of the nugget. And the town even commissioned a stone memorial in 1897 to commemorate the incredible find. Meanwhile, though Deason and Oates made what in the 1860s was an enormous amount of money, it's believed that the welcome stranger would be worth a whole lot more if it were found today. Dermot Henry, head of sciences at the Museum of Victoria, told Australian newspaper The Age in January 2019 that the nugget would be worth nearly $3 million today. But at auction, he argued that the price could jump to $8.5 million. Following their discovery, Deason and Oates were now rich men, and as such, of interest to the press. As the Dunolly and Bedfordshire Express put at the time, Oates has, we believe, neither kith nor kin with whom to share his prize, but probably soon will have. Deason has a wife and family at Maligal, where he holds 80 acres of land, which he believes he intends to settle down upon and cultivate. And settle down, it seems, is exactly what Deason did, and some of his descendants still call the Maligal area home today. But following the find, fortune was not kind to the Cornwall native. Indeed, he lost most of his land and all of his money in failed investments. The digger's great-grandson, Arthur, told The Age he went broke before he died. But even losing everything, it seems, didn't mean that Deason forgot the events that made him in the first place. Indeed, during his interview with The Age, Arthur recalled that when he was young, one of the crowbars his great-grandfather used to pry the nugget free later found a use as part of the garden fence. He continued, "Dad would say, 'That dug up the welcome stranger.' It didn't mean much to us when we were kids." And it seems current residents of the area are also very proud of their golden heritage. Ken Dwell, a committee member of the Goldsfield Historical and Art Society, explained the significance to the Mayboro Advertiser in January 2019. He said, "The town of Dunolly is built on gold and we want to preserve the history of the area. It's hugely important that we celebrate this sort of event. Dunolly is the small town that will never die." As a result, to mark 150 years since the discovery of the welcome stranger, a small celebratory festival was held in Dunolly in February 2019. Most of the commemoration included a museum exhibit displaying the bank scales that confirmed the record breaker. In addition, a costume recreation of a photo session featuring Deason and Oates took place using relatives of the two men. Of course, 150-year-old tales of discovery can often take on mythological properties. For instance, despite knowledge of the true tale of the welcome stranger's discovery, a couple larger-than-life origins have emerged. The first concerned Deason and Oates making their way home from the pub more than a little worse for wear. Deason and Oates both lived in basic shacks in Maligal, and stumbling home after a fair amount of booze, the story has it that the pair simply tripped over the nugget. Meanwhile, another tale has the men on a horse-drawn cart which broke its axle after accidentally driving over the mass. And Deason and Oates' legacy doesn't end there. For the former's great-grandson Arthur, the family name carries with it a certain amount of respect. People, he said, often ask him where gold can be found, and he told The Age what answer he always gives. He said, "If I knew, I'd find it myself." Deason, of course, stayed near the location that made his fortune. But what of Oates? Well, the ex-tin miner moved back to Britain, where he later married and returned to Australia, later having 4 children. Once there, he purchased land in Morong, Victoria, where he lived until his death in 1906. But about the welcome stranger itself, well, the nugget was smelted, made into smaller bars, and sent to Melbourne before finding itself aboard the Regate. From there, it made its way to Britain, ending up in the Bank of England in February 1869. Meanwhile, the welcome stranger isn't the only enormous nugget found in Victoria. 11 years prior to its discovery, more Cornish miners unearthed another gigantic find. Indeed, in June of 1858, a workman's pickaxe struck gold. So much, in fact, he reportedly fainted when he saw it. A co-worker then reportedly found his fellow miner prostrate and thought he'd keeled over and died. But upon turning over his unconscious co-worker, he too saw the nugget and promptly fainted as well. Indeed, so large was the find that miners were convinced that they'd found a solid gold reef. When fully excavated, the gold lump measured 18 by 6 inches and was shaped like the head of a horse. Named the Welcome Nugget, it fetched almost $14,000 when sold in 1859, and eventually ended up at Britain's Royal Mint, where it was melted down and made into sovereigns. Meanwhile, replicas of the Welcome Nugget can be seen at several institutions in Australia, including the Powerhouse Museum and the Museum of Victoria. And another model of the monster find is found in the Mineralogical Museum at Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts. However, some discoveries have been made in more recent decades. Indeed, in 1980, Kevin Hiller found a very special nugget in Victoria using a metal detector. Dubbed the Hand of Faith, the lump of gold weighed almost 60 pounds and stood at just over 18 inches tall. This time, though, the gold wasn't made into bars or sovereigns. In fact, this nugget had a very different fate. Yes, the Hand of Faith was in fact bought by the Golden Nugget chain of casinos for over $1 million, and it can be seen at its branch in Louisiana's Lake Charles. Meanwhile, back in Australia, according to The Age, gold continues to be found in the same region that Oates and Deason found their haul in 1869, with new discoveries helped by more sensitive metal detectors. So it seems that the Australian gold rush isn't quite over just yet. Indeed, Dermot Henry, head of sciences at Museum Victoria, appeared confident in his interview with The Age. He said, "Every year a nugget of more than 100 ounces would come to my attention that'd been found in Victoria. But there are lots we never hear about. So is there another record-breaking lump of gold just waiting to be found?"